Nose is running.
Okay, and good afternoon. Hello, Darien, and hello, everybody at the H here. My name is Evan Weiner. Been here before. We're going to talk about, on this beautiful Friday afternoon, the calendar year 1961. I was 4 and 5 years old. And John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier. And ask not what your country could do for you. Ask what you could do for your country. Kennedy, the young man, replacing Eisenhower, who was 70 years old, and a new outlook for the United States with John Kennedy now as the president of the United States. And there is the outgoing president down there on the bottom. That is, of course, Dwight Eisenhower. So the New Frontier, all new in 1961, but some old problems remain. A threat from 90 miles from the United States down in Cuba. Also, the civil rights movement is accelerating with Martin Luther King and sit-ins all around the South. Adolf Eichmann was tried for, hold on one second, I'm muting everybody. Okay, I think we got that. Okay, Adolf Eichmann was tried for war crimes in Israel from his role in the Nazi and the Holocaust days in the 1940s. Vietnam, take a look at John Kennedy talking about Vietnam, would accelerate. There would be more and more going on in terms of what's going on in Vietnam. Also, the Cold War and the beginnings of the Berlin Wall in 1961. And Newton Minow, who is still alive, he's about 95 years old, he's up in Milwaukee now, and he talked about how television was a vast wasteland. Newton Minow talking about how poor television was in terms of the quality of entertainment you were getting. It's goodbye, Ike. Hello, JFK. Dwight Eisenhower ends his second term as President of the United States in January of 1961. But in his final days as the president, he makes a critical decision. On January 3rd, 1961, the United States would break diplomatic relations with Cuba. Now, the whole Cuban story starts in 1946 because in 1956, Fidel Castro and his associates started guerrilla war as a way of toppling the Batista government. Batista was a dictator, had ties to the United States. Eisenhower backed him, and also to the mafia in the United States. By 1959, Castro and his associates brought down Batista. Castro would turn to the Soviet Union. The Cold War was now 90 miles away from the United States shores in Florida. The 1960 election in the Electoral College. Stop me if you've heard this just recently. There's a dispute trying to delegitimize John Kennedy as the president of the United States. The 1960 presidential race was highly contested. JFK won by a narrow margin. Nixon would concede, but there was a group of politicians not happy, and they decided to contest the race. The group was made up of mostly white conservative electors from the South who opposed the liberal policies that John Kennedy had talked about and his support for civil rights for Black Americans. Although that wasn't that clear. The only thing JFK did while running for president in 1960 was get Martin Luther King out of jail after a sit-in in Atlanta. But that was enough to get people really upset at John F. Kennedy. The Republicans claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states. They filed suit in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois. Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes in Illinois. The suit in Illinois said that Dick Daley, Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago and Cook County, somehow, they dug up voters from cemeteries in Chicago, and those voters voted for John Kennedy. Judges threw out both suits. Nixon took no part in the vote, the challenges, and told a reporter that our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. But what was the aim of these people? Topple John F. Kennedy if possible. Electors from Alabama and Mississippi would not cast their votes for Kennedy, who had won both states. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors were unpledged in the Electoral College. The electors lobbied their counterparts in the other states to aid and abet their plan. Plan A, the electors from southern states, 11 of them, would use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop U.S. aid to communist countries and support state rights if he wanted their votes. Now, states' rights, that was a code for resisting racial integration. If Kennedy refused, well, plan B. We'll have a resolution. We'll reverse the position of the candidates. Lyndon Johnson would become president. John Kennedy would be his vice president. And if that didn't work, well, let's elect Harry Byrd. Harry Byrd, the Republican electors in the Electoral College from all 50 states would meet in Chicago to pick a president from a list of outstanding Southern men. Among the choices, Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, segregationist governors Orville Farbus of Arkansas, Russ Barnett of Mississippi, and the Georgia Senator Richard Russell. In the end, Byrd received 15 electoral votes for president in 1960. Those were the unpledged electors from Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma, and they casted their votes for Byrd instead of Kennedy, and their goal was to delegitimize John F. Kennedy as president of the United States, to cast some doubt. He was illegitimate, but at the end of the day, Kennedy would get 303 electoral college votes, or 34,227,096 votes. Nixon would get 219 electoral college votes, or 34,107,646. And Byrd, who ended up with 15 electoral college votes, had 116,248 votes. The civil rights movement is going ahead with full steam in the South. That is January 12th, and that is at the University of Georgia, and that is Charlene Hunter. You might know who Charlene Hunter is to this day. She started classes at the University of Georgia under federal order, but withdrew the night before for her own protection because students staged an uprising against integration. Like I said, you might know who she is today. Dr. Charlene Hunter Gault, journalist. You might have seen her on PBS. Eisenhower says goodbye, January 17th, 1961. And he makes a speech. And he ends the term by warning against the nation, the United States, about increasing power of the military-industrial complex. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government, must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience, the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without asking the loss of their political and spiritual heritage. From the oldest to the youngest, elected president, Theodore Roosevelt took over from William McKinley, who was younger than John Kennedy, but that was after McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Ask not what your country, as John Kennedy looks at Carolyn and John and their horse, Yankee Doodle. Ask not what you can do for your country, ask what you could do for your country. The new frontier. At the age of 43, John F. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected the president of the United States. And image was everything, perceived perception. Oh, he had thick hair. He wore cool sunglasses. Jackie was really young. Jackie was 29. She was the stylish wife, and they had 2 small children. There were touch football games. He was a World War II hero, saving his men after his patrol boat was sunk. The image, there she is in one of the latest creations, complete with a pillbox hat and John F. Kennedy in that blue outfit. Image is everything. And even to Kennedy's dying day, he talked about Jackie's image when she was late for a speech in Fort Worth that morning. It was raining, and he says, you know, it takes quite a while for Mrs. Kennedy to get ready. In JFK's world, there was the Cold War. There was Cuba. There was the Civil Rights Movement. There was Vietnam. And there was the space race. That was JFK's world. The Cold War, he ran on the campaign of a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. Adolf Eichmann finally goes to trial in Israel in 1961 for his war crimes during the Nazi era. And here he is explaining himself. On May 23rd, 1960, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced that Adolf Eichmann was captured and would stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer, organized Adolf Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question. He was seized by agents on May 11th, and Ben-Gurion made his announcement May 23rd, smuggled into Israel 9 days later. On April 11th, 1961, Eichmann's trial began in Jerusalem. It was the first trial ever to be televised in history. He faced 15 charges, including crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. He claims he was just following orders. The judges disagreed, found him guilty on all counts on December 15th, sentenced him to die. On May 31st, 1962, he was hanged near Tel Aviv. His body subsequently cremated, his ashes thrown into the sea. Now, Kennedy's first major mistake in his presidency is this, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was April 17th, 1961. Now, this Bay of Pigs invasion actually started during the Eisenhower administration, when Eisenhower started to recruit Cuban exiles to maybe invade the island nation of Cuba. But Kennedy takes over, and a brigade of about 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exile soldiers stormed the beach in Cuba's Bay of Pigs as part of a secret mission to overthrow Fidel Castro. And the other goal was to halt the spread of communism throughout the world. It failed, spectacularly failed. The mission was set into motion on April 15th with a series of airstrikes to take out Castro's defenses. The plan was not executed well, and it missed the Cuban planes. And more problems would occur the next day because JFK said, no more airstrikes. Do it without air cover. And that's a problem. Castro, during the Bay of Pigs invasion, captured in that picture. Without air support, most of the April 15th, April 17th invaders were taken prisoners. 90 of the invaders were killed. Castro became entrenched. The ties between the Soviet Union and Cuba would strengthen. The Cuban exile invaders were released from Cuban prisons between 1962 and 65. There was a deal cut with the United States. Cuba got $53 million worth of food and medicine. Castro would end any elections in Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Civil rights movement, freedom rides. Freedom's wheels are rolling. The land of the law is our demand. End segregation. As that bus takes off to the south, and the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders rode interstate buses into the segregated United States starting in 1961 to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decision, Morgan versus Virginia, Boynton versus Virginia, that ruled segregated buses were unconstitutional. The southern states ignored the rulings, and the federal government did nothing to enforce them, at least through then. And the first Freedom Ride left Washington, D.C. on May 4th, going into New Orleans, and was scheduled to arrive on May 17th. One of the buses didn't make it. It was firebombed. So there was violence as the Freedom Ride was going. This is Mother's Day, May 14th. And angry white people blocked a Greyhound bus carrying black and white passengers through rural Alabama. The attackers pelted the vehicle with rocks and bricks, slashed tires, smashed windows with pipes and axes, and lobbied a firebomb through a broken window. As the smoke and flames filled the bus, the mob barricaded the door. Somebody yells, "Burn them alive." John Lewis is also getting himself into what he eventually would call good trouble down in the South as a demonstrator as part of a student group called SNCC. May 24th, Martin Luther King wants to get on one of those buses. He's in Atlanta buying a bus ticket. John Kennedy was rather slow to react to the civil rights movement. Oh, sure, he campaigned on doing something, and in 1960, he called Coretta Scott King, along with Bobby Kennedy, the wife of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, after King was imprisoned on trumped-up charges after leading a sit-in in Atlanta. RFK, Robert Kennedy, is now the Attorney General. But in 1960, as the campaign manager, he makes a call to get Martin Luther King out of jail. The calls pretty much go unnoticed during the campaign, but the civil rights people want some action from John Kennedy. And he's sitting on his hands, and he's doing absolutely nothing about housing segregation or busing segregation. In November, Robert Kennedy's May 29th memo to end segregation of interstate busing took effect. And what that did was allow African Americans from the North to get on the Greyhound buses, get on the Trailway buses, and go to the South to join in on the demonstrations. Kennedy's other problem is Vietnam, and it's escalating. The American troops are finally sent into Vietnam as advisors. On January 19th, there's a meeting between Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy. Transition, that's what normally happens. The outgoing and ingoing presidents speak to one another. Eisenhower didn't mention Vietnam as one of the major problems facing the US, but he says that Laos is the problem. Laos is the entire key to Southeast Asia. Take care of Laos before you take care of Vietnam, because in Eisenhower's view, he thought Laos, which was a weak country, would be the beginning of the loss of most of the Far East to communism if the United States didn't do anything in Laos. There's the domino theory. Oh yeah, China is going to set the first domino going. That would be in Korea, South Korea, and then it would be Vietnam, and then it would be Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, Burma, India, who knows, maybe even New Zealand and Australia. You got to watch out because those dominoes would fall. 1954, after the French Indochina pullout, Eisenhower started worrying about how the country of Vietnam or Vietnam colony had split into two, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The loss of Vietnam to communist control would lead to communist victories elsewhere: Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, India, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. The possible consequence of the loss are just incalculable to the free world. In his final days as president, the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev pledges support for wars of national liberation throughout the world. And North Vietnam's leader, Ho Chi Minh, is listening. And John F. Kennedy at one of his news conferences is determined not to lose South Vietnam. And the troops start going in. May 1961, Kennedy sends 400 American Green Beret special advisors to South Vietnam. And they're there to train the South Vietnamese soldiers in the methods of counterinsurgency in the fight against the Viet Cong guerrillas. The Viet Cong had just formed in December of 1960. October 24th, 1961, on the 6th anniversary of the Republic of South Vietnam, Kennedy sends a letter to the South Vietnamese President Diem and pledges the United States is determined to help Vietnam preserve its independence. Kennedy sends additional military advisors along with an American helicopter units to transport and direct South Vietnamese troops in the battle. Kennedy wants to prevent a communist takeover of Vietnam, which he said is in accordance with our policy of government that has followed since 1954. Meanwhile, did we ever end the war in Korea? Well, was it ever a war? It was supposed to be a police action. There was a truce signed in 1953. That truce has lasted 68 years as a truce. Occasionally, there'd be a flare-up, like in 1961, where you could see the Americans and the Koreans in hand-to-hand battle, one of the skirmishes. The space race, man enters space, a blow to the American prestige, because the man that entered space was Yuri Gagarin, who was a Soviet cosmonaut. The Soviets had beaten the Americans into space, getting the first satellite up, the Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. Gagarin, on April 12th, 1961, became the first human in space. 108-minute orbital flight in Vostok 1 around the Earth and then coming back down. The Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard would become the first American in a suborbital mission about a month later in May of 1961. And there is Gagarin, the astronaut, and Leonid Brezhnev, who at that point was high up in the Soviet Politburo. Shepard's flight, May 5th. It was a suborbital 15-minute flight just to prove that they could get a man up and going. They also had a chimpanzee named Ham that was up and going earlier that year. JFK and the space program. John Kennedy really didn't care about the space program. John Kennedy cared about having man on the moon. And the man on the moon better be American because you got to beat the Soviets. As far as the everyday getting man to the moon, all the stages and all that, didn't care about that. All he cared about was landing an American on the moon. The Soviet space probe Vernier 1, the first man-made vehicle to reach another planet, that was 1961 when it arrived around Venus. On May 25th, Kennedy makes an announcement before a special joint session of Congress with the goal of sending an American safely to the moon before the end of the decade. In general, Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States catch up and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. The space race, even though I thought it was cool as a kid, watching astronauts being shot up into space, I didn't realize as a kid it was just another part of the Cold War, and America was losing that part of the Cold War. The June summit in JFK. JFK is meeting with Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. And John Kennedy, one of his problems, as historians have pointed out since his death, was he didn't listen to people. And this is one of the instances he didn't listen to people. On June 4th, JFK and Khrushchev are to meet at the Vienna summit in Australia. Afterwards, Kennedy told the New York Times reporter, he savaged me. Khrushchev said, this man's very inexperienced, even immature. Compared to him, Eisenhower is a man of intelligence and vision. Kennedy ignored what his advisors told him. Don't talk about communist ideology. That'll get you stuck wasting time talking about Marxism. And Kennedy does just that. And he defends the aspects of pre-World War II status quo, like British imperialism. And he also tells Khrushchev he considered the Sino-Soviet forces and U.S. Western forces about equally balanced, not knowing that the Soviets and the Chinese, the Sinos, weren't getting along. Kennedy and Khrushchev continued to communicate. Both understood that neither wanted nuclear war, but it was a possibility. The Cold War. John Kennedy is in Berlin, July 25th of 61, and he says any attack on NATO would be an attack on any other country. In 1949, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States founded NATO. 3 other members were added, Greece and Turkey in 1952 and West Germany in 1955. In August, the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, tells NATO, be prepared for anything, including nuclear war. The Berlin Wall is constructed or starts construction on August 13th. And there is the Berlin Wall going up, separating West Berlin from East Berlin, from the free West Berlin from the communist-controlled East Berlin. The construction of the wall was commenced by the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, August 13th. The wall cut off West Berlin from surrounding East Germany, including East Berlin. The barrier included guard towers placed along large concrete walls, accompanied by a wide area that contained anti-vehicle trenches, beds of nails, and other defenses. There you see it being built. In 1955, the Soviets told the East Germans, it's up to you. You know, you take care of whatever happens in Berlin. Initially, East Germany granted visas to allow its citizens access to West Germany. However, following the defections of a large number of East Germans, the new East German state legally restricted virtual all travel to the West in 1956. And there you see the wall, which separated neighborhoods being built. The closing of the east-west sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans could no longer travel or emigrate to West Germany. Families were split. East Berliners employed in the West lost their jobs. West Berlin became an isolated enclave in a hostile land. Most West Berliners demonstrated against the wall, led by the mayor Willy Brandt, who strongly criticized the United States for failing to respond to the building of the wall, criticizing John Kennedy. The wall didn't stop people. People did try to escape and flee into the West, and some of them made it, some of them didn't. Meanwhile, this 15-minute interlude in Times Square, you remember Bond, Two Trouser Suit? I remember Bond's clothes, Woolworths, hey, those are gone. Old names gone forever. Anyway, this was a air raid drill practice in case anything did happen. For 15 minutes, Times Square is shut down. The only visible life, a cop and a guard dog. Hiding under a desk. How many of you hid under a desk in school? I did, duck and cover. But there were fallout shelters. On September 15th, if you had a magazine or you subscribed to Life magazine, you got a little letter from the President of the United States. And it basically said, my fellow Americans, nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war are facts of life we cannot ignore today. Be prepared. Enter the fallout shelter. The federal government would soon begin a program to improve the protection afforded you in your communities through civil defense. These shelters were not going to protect people from exploding bombs, but get people away from a bomb and might offer some protection from bomb materials that were scattered for weeks after an attack. Oh, there would be some food available, some other necessities available. On October 29th, the USSR detonated a 50 megaton hydrogen bomb in the largest man-made explosion in history. This stuff's getting serious. Oh, you wanted a fancier fallout shelter? Take a look at this one. You got your canned food, you got your canned water, you got your sleeping bags, and you could sleep up top there, you could sleep down in the bottom. There's your fallout shelter. It was a fancier fallout shelter. Goodbye, 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 Joe Stalin. Goodbye. Well, you were dead, so goodbye. Well, he had been dead for a long time by this point, 8 years. Goodbye, Uncle Joe. The Soviet Party Congress unanimously approves a resolution removing Stalin's body from Lenin's tomb in Red Square in Moscow as part of de-Stalinization efforts. The Peace Corps. Peace Corps, well, the Soviets were leery of the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is set up to get away from the ugly American stereotype. March 1st, 1961, Kennedy signed Executive Order 10924 that officially started the Peace Corps. Concerned with the growing tide of revolutionary sentiment in the Third World, Kennedy saw the Peace Corps as a means of countering the stereotype of the ugly American and Yankee imperialism, especially in the nations that were emerging in Africa and Asia. Kennedy appointed his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to be the program's first director. And so the Peace Corps was born during the Cold War. It was created to capture the hearts and minds of people in the non-aligned developing countries. Do we go with the Soviets, do we go with the Chinese, or do we go with the Americans? Let's see if we could get them to go with the Americans. In 1960, 17 African nations declared independence. The continent was beginning to face the realities of post-colonial violence. In 1960, the beginning of the opposition to South Africa's apartheid government. In 1960, all the colonies of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa became independent. Ghana was the first country in the world to welcome the Peace Corps. The first group of volunteers arrived in Ghana on August 30th. By year's end, 500 Peace Corps volunteers were in Chile, Colombia, Ghana, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, St. Lucia, Tanzania, and Pakistan. Khrushchev and the Soviets said the Peace Corps volunteers were spies. Meanwhile, back in the USA, which was a big Chuck Berry song of the era, there's George Lincoln Rockwell, and he's got his heat bus going around the South. He was a Nazi, and he had no problems telling you he was a Nazi, stopping for Texaco gasoline, and there are some of his colleagues. We do hate race mixing. Lincoln Rockwell's heat bus. The Freedom Riders, here's one, Joan Trempar. And she's arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. She was a 19-year-old Duke student and part-time secretary in the Washington office of the Senator Claire Engel of California. She arrives in Jackson, Mississippi to take part in the June 4th Mississippi Freedom Ride. She and 8 others were promptly arrested and refused bail. She would serve 3 months in jail. Later, she would enroll in the traditionally Black Tougaloo College, which had just started accepting white students. In Albany, Georgia, another civil rights action. The Albany Movement began in November. It was the first mass movement in the modern civil rights era. Its goal, desegregation of an entire community. The jailing of more than 1,000 African Americans in Albany took place in surrounding rural counties. Martin Luther King was brought down there in December of 1961 when hundreds of Black protesters, including himself, were arrested in 1 week. 8 months later, though, King left Albany, admitting that he failed to accomplish the movement's goal, which was to desegregate Albany. But voter registration increased. As you could see, people were registering to vote in the South because of the civil rights movement. After King left, the African-American businessman Thomas Chapman secured enough votes in the election for a city commission seat to force a runoff election the following spring of '62. The Albany Commission removed all segregation statutes from its books. The courts, Judge Irving Kaufman ordered the Board of Education of New Rochelle to integrate the schools in New Rochelle on May 31st. Gardner versus Louisiana, the court overruled the disturbing the peace convictions of 5 African Americans who had engaged in sit-ins at an all-white restaurant counter in Baton Rouge. On September 20th, 1961, James Meredith, a student at the all-Black Jackson State College, filed a lawsuit against the University of Mississippi alleging racial discrimination. The case was eventually settled on appeal by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in September of 1962 that he could go to school at Ole Miss. Now, think of this. Francisco Franco, fascist dictator of Spain. Francisco Franco, civil rights pioneer? He was. Believe it or not, he was. Spain, equal rights for women in the workplace, signed into law July 22nd, 1961. The fascist leader, Francisco Franco, change in the law made it easier for women to gain employment in the public sector. Women had faced many restrictions, including the need for their husbands to approve their job before allowing them to sign an employment contract. The 1961 law gave women in the workforce additional rights they had previously lacked by recognizing the importance of their work. Well, this law entitled single women to be at a salary equal to that of her male peers working in the same job. Yesterday, there were people who visited the White House to press on Joe Biden to make sure American women get paid what American men paid equally in the same job. That was on March 26th, that was March 25th, 2021. March 29th, the 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified. That allowed the residents of Washington, D.C. to vote in presidential elections. Right now, residents of Washington, D.C. are pushing for statehood. April 13th, in Portugal, a coup against the leader, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, fails. November 19th, a military uprising overthrows the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic. There were various wars and revolts in Africa, which means John Kennedy's job is really, really tough, what's going on around the world and in the United States. In the Middle East, the Iraqi government threatened to invade Kuwait, and the invasion was finally averted following plans by the Arab League to form an international Arab force against Iraqi's designs on Kuwait. And that would simmer until 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. September 28th, a military coup in Damascus, Syria ends the United Arab Republic, which was a union between Egypt and Syria. That is Newton Minow. Newton Minow was the head of the Federal Communications Commission back in 1961. And Newton Minow called television a vast wasteland. Television in the public interest, a speech. Newton, head of the Federal Communications Commission, said commercial television landscape was a vast wasteland and advocated instead for public service television. Minow successfully encouraged CBS, NBC, ABC to expand their nightly news programs from 15 minutes to a half hour, and he pushed for educational TV. A vast wasteland. Probably some of you sat around the TV like that. I remember we only had one TV, so we had to sit around like that. Minow, you see, talking about TV, you will see a procession of game shows, formula comedies about totally unbelievable families, blood and thunder, mayhem, violence, sadism, murder, Western bad men, Western good men, private eyes, gangsters, more violence in cartoons, and endlessly commercials, many screaming, cajoling, and offending, and most of all, boredom. True, you'll see a few things you will enjoy, but they will be very, very few. And if you think I exaggerate, I only ask you to try it. Oh, that's the skipper of the Minnow, the SS Minnow. Minnow spelled his name M-I-N-O-W. The SS Minnow, the ship that was shipwrecked for Gilligan's Island, M-I-N-N-O-W. 3-hour tour, right? That would come years later. Gilligan's Island's TV boat was named for Newton Minow because the executive producer and creator of Gilligan's Island, Sherwin Schwartz, thought that Minow was ruining television. Diapers, no more cloth diapers. Pampers debuted. You didn't have to use the cloth diapers, you could use the paper diapers and dispose them. Saves you time washing diapers. Baseball changes, that's Roger Maris, and that is the 1961 season. It was the first season where there were 18 teams in baseball, 2 teams additionally in the American League, and Roger Maris would set the home run record, beating Babe Ruth's record of 60, hitting his 61st home run on the final day of the season. But baseball, as always, has these old traditions that they cling to, which actually has hurt them in the modern era. 1961 is the first season of the 18-team major leagues. The American League approves the transfer of the Washington Senators to Minneapolis. This expands the league by 2 teams. Actually, they would expand by 2 teams to Los Angeles and Washington. The American League would adopt a 162-game schedule. Ford Frick, who is the baseball commissioner, Ford Frick, the baseball commissioner, was a friend of Babe Ruth and a friend of his widow, Claire Ruth. And he didn't want to see his old buddy's home run record broken. So he makes this ruling saying that, yeah, you know, if he does hit more than 60 home runs, he better do it in a 154-game schedule, not in a 162-game schedule, because it really wouldn't be right because he played extra games and had extra opportunities to hit home runs. Babe Ruth hit his 60 home runs in a 154-game schedule in 1927. So if he does it, he better do it before 154 games. Maris would hit the home run in the last day of the season to get to 61 and beat Ruth's record. And that record would not be eclipsed until the steroids era in the 1990s. Oh, the Ken doll. Bobby has a playmate. The Ken doll is introduced into popular culture. Everyday life would change in 1961 in some way. Electric toothbrushes would be introduced. Bobby Roberts, I don't know how many of you had a Barbie doll, if any of you did. She gets a boyfriend. Frito corn chips appear. Cassius Clay hits the stage in 1961 as a professional. And he does rather well for himself. And he becomes very quickly one of the high-rising prospects in boxing's heavyweight division. Hey, you want to see the Beatles? You could. February 6, 1961. A quintet, when they left Liverpool for Hamburg in 1960, they are back in Liverpool as a four-man group. George Harrison there, Pete Best, the drummer, Paul McCartney, John Lennon. One show at the Cavern Club, The Beatles, February 9th, 1961, Matthew Street in Liverpool. The Beatles would perform there over the next 2 years and would leave Liverpool and obviously would conquer the world by 1964. The legacy of 1961. It's a legacy that you think about. 1961. John Kennedy did very little in 1961 to support the civil rights movement. He did very little in 1962. In 1963, he is pushed after reading the New York Times and seeing on the front page a dog attack a protester in Birmingham, Alabama. Television coverage would become severe. It would be out there. Television coverage would be out there. And he gets worried in 1963 and starts the process of the civil rights movement. But of course, he wouldn't live to see it because he'd be killed on November 22nd, 1963. The situation in Cuba would continue to deteriorate and would come to a head in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. At some point, John Kennedy moved missiles into Turkey. And that moved Nikita Khrushchev to move missiles into Cuba. And there would be a stalemate of sorts, and there would be the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The United States would continue to support the South Vietnamese. By 1964, August 7th, 1964, there would be the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That Gulf of Tonkin Resolution would put the United States onto the fast track of escalating the war and would entrench the United States into a war that would last until 1973, would cause divisions in the country. But that would happen in 1964. In 1961, the Montana senator, and he was the Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, said you have to reform the Electoral College. It's out of date. It shouldn't be there anymore. Presidential election should be based on the popular vote. It was not based on the popular vote. It was based on the Electoral College. And you could see the problems that the Electoral College has had over the past number of years in terms that the loser of the election, because of this antiquated system that started back in the 1780s, 1790s, would win because of where the population was located. But there was just that talk of the Electoral College needing to be reformed. But nothing else happened. That was basically it. Nothing happened. And now you got the talk in 2021 of the same thing. Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait in 1990, which would force the United States to get involved in Gulf War #1. The United States stopped at taking over Baghdad. George Bush said, President George Bush said that the mission was accomplished. In Kuwait, we kept the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and of course would not go away. There would be another Gulf War in 2003 involving the United States and involving Iraq. There are still civil rights issues that are bandied about. Yesterday, the Georgia legislature passed a new sweeping Voters' Rights Act, or lack of Voters' Rights Act, which includes if you give somebody waiting, standing on line, some food or some water in Georgia as they wait online to vote, well, you know what? You could be cited with a misdemeanor for helping somebody who might be thirsty. In 1961, there was still a poll tax for African Americans and a literacy tax to vote. That was gone in 1964. So if you think that the problems of 1960 have gone away, they haven't. John Kennedy faced Cuba. Well, we're still facing Cuba. There was a civil rights movement. Well, parts of that civil rights movement were settled and parts of it wasn't. There was a problem with Russia or the Soviet Union. There's still a problem with Russia and the Soviet Union. Red China, Communist China, Mao Zedong did not talk. There was no communication between 1949 and 1973, 1972, 1973 between the United States and the People's Republic of China or Red China. There is sort of a Cold War that's going on today between the Chinese and the Americans. Women did not have a chance at equal college education in 1961. For women, most careers were nurses, teachers, and secretaries, and being part of Bell Telephone as an operator. Most women could not get into medical school. Most women could not get into law school. But it would take another 11 years for that to be rectified. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not take care of women in education. That would happen in 1972. The women's lib movement had not started at this point, but Betty Friedan was putting together her papers, doing interviews with women that she had met at her 15th reunion of Smith College back in 1957. She graduated in 1942, and she's putting together what she hopes would be a magazine article about how women didn't particularly like being housewives. However, magazines didn't want to do anything about it, and they turned her down. She was a writer, so instead she decided to write a book. It was called The Feminine Mystique, and by 1966, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and others would form the National Organization for Women Now, and the Civil Rights Movement. That particular Civil Rights Movement would start in 1966. So John Kennedy's first year was kind of a disaster, the Bay of Pigs, and that was bad. And his meetings with Nikita Khrushchev, that was bad. And his decisions on Vietnam, that was bad. But 1962 would follow, and then comes 1963 and the rest of the swinging 60s. Thank you so much, Patty, for inviting me, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, feel free. It's up to you to talk to me. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Well, I enjoyed it very much.
Hi, Elizabeth. How are you doing today?
Okay. I know I enjoyed it. Took me back to a lot of things that happened when I can remember them all happening.
How did that stuff impact you? What went on?
I was, my first election to vote in was the JFK election, and that caused a huge stir because he was Catholic, and my husband was in the Army, and we were in the Midwest, and everybody out there thought surely if he was elected, the Pope would be running the country. I can remember that vividly.
Well,
lots of this stuff, yeah.
Yeah, he and Al Smith both had the same problem.
Yeah.
You know, the irony now is that prior to the presidential election, in the years of the presidential election, that both candidates show up at the Al Smith dinner raising money. And, you know, it's sort of a roast, but it's the Al Smith dinner. And you got to think that both Al Smith and John F. Kennedy actually were scary figures for no real reason other than their religion.
Yeah, I know. Just what I remembered from that 1961 in particular, yeah.
Yeah, and your husband was based in the United States.
Yeah, he was.
So,
Yes.
you know, Vietnam was percolating in those days.
Yeah, back in he was in 59. Yeah, it was just percolating then, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you, Elizabeth. Glad you enjoyed it. Anybody else has anything to say? Well, anyway, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Gigi. Thank you, Louise. And thank you, Patty, for inviting me. And we will see you again in 2 weeks when we will continue this, 1962, and which is an interesting year in all of these, whether it just continues, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and Betty Friedan is rejected in terms of her magazine articles and decides to write the book, The Feminine Mystique, and puts it out in 1963. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Patty. My name is Evan Weiner. We will see you in 2 weeks, and I got my shots. So I am going to be clear on April 7th, and I'm actually going to be starting to speak in person at the Atria in Rybrook. We'll see how that goes on April 28th. And if that goes well, maybe there'll be other places as well that I could get out of the house finally. But thank you so much. And we will talk to you in 2 weeks. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the weather outside. It's gorgeous. And I will send a copy to Patty. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.